Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So as always, thank you all for coming. And again, I apologize for the time it takes to get this set up. The visual aids are very important for us at this stage in our study. And these are some of the things that we hope to cover this evening. Last week we began our discussion of the categories of Tawhid. Aqsam at-Tawhid al-Thalatha. We'll also try to look today at what is worship, defining worship Islamically, what is a shirk, and hopefully we'll get to the degrees of a shirk and how do we distinguish between the degrees of a shirk. So we began last week talking about Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, the first category of a Tawhid, which we said is monotheism in Allah's worship, and we explained that what that Tawhid al-Rububiyyah means is it's related to Af'alillah al-Khassa. It's related to the actions of Allah which are exclusive to Him. And then we talked a little bit about some of the actions which are exclusive to Him. We didn't give an exhaustive list, but we gave some examples. So we mentioned, for example, giving life, causing death, granting advantage, prosperity, willing detriment, disadvantage, creating a cause-effect relationship between things, and we talked about that in detail, providing sustenance, willing the outcomes, predetermining that what will happen in the future. And want to touch on this one, number 8, affecting objects without any direct contact with the object. We'll talk about that a little bit before we move on to the second category. I need a timekeeper. Somebody set an alarm for 35 minutes. Alarm that I'll hear. After 35 minutes it'll sound, I'll hear it and I'll know. 35 minutes. Mumtaz. Jazakumullah khairan. All right. So, affecting objects without any direct contact with the object. One of the, and by the way, I sent an updated version of the study review guide to our WhatsApp group. So what you can do is you can follow along on that review guide and you'll have a lot of the questions and information related to what we're going to talk about with some blanks, and you can just fill in the blanks as you go, and it'll keep good notes for you. So those of you who are with us on WhatsApp will see the study/review guide, and you can open that and follow along as we go. So number 8, from Af'alillah al-Khassa bihi, from the actions that Allah performs that no one else can do, they're exclusive to Him, He has a monopoly on them, is affecting objects without any direct contact with the object. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of His actions that He does is He impacts creation. He influences objects without any ittisal, without any connection between Him and the object that He influences. So for example, me. Let's say I wanted to open that door. I have to walk over to the door physically. And I have to do what? I have to push it open. If it were a door with a knob that I had to pull, I'd have to actually turn that knob, exert some force and pull it open. I can't stand here and hold out my hands and concentrate and open that door because there's no what? There's no ittisal, right? There's no physical influence that I'm exerting, no contact I'm making with the object. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who can influence objects, impact creation, without any ittisal, without any connection between Him and the objects. We have many examples of this in the Quran and Hadith. I'll give you a few real quick. In Surah Al-Baqarah, the 2nd chapter, verse number 259 or thereabouts, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about a man who passed by a qaryah, passed by a town. And that town was totally demolished and decayed, and the people in it had died and wasted away. And the man he walked past this and he says, I just refuse to believe that Allah can resurrect these people, can give life to the vegetation and to the people. He can basically resurrect what was in this qaryah. So Allah wanted to teach him a lesson. So He caused him to die. And he let him be deceased for 100 years. Then he calls him to come back to life. Now with him, when he was on this journey, he had some food, he had some drink, and he had a donkey. That donkey also died. 100 years, it died. Not only did it die, it decomposed. But his food, which naturally, you guys know, if you leave food out for a few days, it starts to what? To rot and decay and basically begin to waste away. Is that not so? His food remained just as it was. You leave out a cup of water. This is a scientific experiment we did, first, second, third grade. Leave out a cup of water for a few days. What happens? It evaporates. It didn't evaporate. Allah gave him life after 100 years, and there was his food, just as he had left it. His drink hadn't evaporated. Who was it that prevented that food from decaying and the water from evaporating? Without what? Any ittisal. Not only this, Allah said, look at your donkey. The donkey had what? Had decayed and decomposed. Allah made the bones come back together. Then closed the bones with muscle and nerve and then flesh. Right in front of the man's eyes. Bidun ay shay, without what? Without any connection between him and the actual object he was influencing or impacting. Another example, in the hadith, famous hadith of Bukhari Muslim, on the authority of Abd'Llah ibn Umar. He talks about how the Prophet ﷺ told a story to them about 3 men from Bani Israel. They were on a journey and they got caught in a rainstorm. So they sought refuge in a cave. So when they went into this cave, seeking refuge from the rain, a stone fell from the mountain above and covered the mouth of the cave. So they were trapped. And so they said, okay, what are we going to do? So one of them said, the only way for you to get out of this situation is for you to seek al-wasila, to seek to draw close to Allah and to invoke His help through some good deed that you did. So each one of them stepped forward and made dua to Allah, mentioning a good deed that they did. And every time they did that, the stone did what? It moved slightly. The stone moved. Who moved it? Bidun ay shay, without what? Without any connection, without any ittisal between him and what? And the stone. Likewise, when the Prophet ﷺ in the seerah, it's mentioned of the Prophet ﷺ that the night that he intended to make hijrah, the pagans had gathered one member of each tribe outside of his home with the intention of assassinating him. And the only way that he could get out of his home was to pass by them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed a veil over their eyes and made them unable to see the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet walked right past them. This veil that was placed over their eyes, it was placed over their eyes by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bidun ay shay, without any direct contact between him and the object. This is something that Allah does and no one else can do. But suppose a person called upon another person in a different land. He said, oh Sayyid Fulan, I'm drowning, save me. What would he be implying by that call for this person who is what? In another place. He would be implying, go ahead Mustafa, what would he be implying?
That he has powers that he can hear everything.
Not just he can hear everything, very good. That he could hear everything, that's one. That's one act of shirk that he would be committing. But what's another one related to this?
He can move.
He can impact an object, influence a creature without what? Without any ittisal, without any contact between him. And this is an action which is specific to Allah. And this is why it's important for us to understand this, because a lot of people, they'll say things, and we heard this last week, they'll say calling upon someone who's not present or calling on someone who's deceased in a grave is not shirk. They don't really understand it is shirk, because we said that at-Tawhid, which is the opposite of a shirk, is ifradullahi bi kulli ma yakhtassu bihi. It is singling out Allah and making him the sole recipient of everything which is specific to him. Among the things which are specific to him are affecting objects without any direct contact with that object. As soon as we give that to somebody else, what have we done? Committed shirk. And sometimes that shirk happens lafdan. It happens by something we say. And sometimes it happens by what? I'tiqadan. And sometimes it happens by the actions. The things that we do indicate that what? We believe that someone can affect objects without any contact between them. This is something which is khas, it's something specific to Allah. طيب, so with that, these are a couple of examples I wanted to give and hit on from Ar-Rububiyyah. طيب, let's go now to Tawhid al-Asma'i wa Sifat. So basically, when we talk about Tawhid al-Asma'i wa Sifat, we're talking about the monotheism of Allah's names and attributes. That we ensure that we only call Allah by His names, which are specific to Him. Like Ar-Rahman, As-Sami'a, Al-Basir, Al-Qawi, Al-Hakim. We only call Allah by these names, right? And most of these names, if not all of them, are accompanied by a corresponding attribute. So for example, As-Sami'a, the all-hearing, means Allah has that quality of hearing what? Kulli masmu', every sound, right? Possessing the ability to hear all things, to see all things, to bestow His mercy without restriction or impediment. But that's not all. Tawheed or Tawheed al-Asma'i wa Sifat, it also includes that specifically the Tawheed of Allah's attributes, as-Sifat. It also includes other attributes that by name resemble those of what? His creatures, like His face, His eyes, His hands, His shin, His feet, etc. Which Allah has confirmed for Himself and His Messenger has confirmed for Him in the Sunnah. But part of this aspect of Allah's Tawheed is affirming these attributes. Saying, yes, Allah has a face because He said. He has hands because He said. He has eyes because He said, right? But confirming them in a way that A, befits His majesty, befits Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, and does not resemble that of any of His creatures. Somebody says, well, wait a minute, how are we supposed to, Allah has a face, we have faces. They have to be the same, right? Because they're called by the same name. But the resemblance between our face and Allah's face, it stops there. They resemble each other in name only, but the reality, they're totally different. His attributes are what? Exclusive. Khassa bihi. They are specific to Him, so we can't understand them. We can't believe in them. We can't comprehend them in a way which resembles that of His creatures. They are only, if there's any resemblance, the only semblance is in name only. Our hand is not like Allah's hand. Our face is not like His face. Our eyes are not like His eyes. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There's nothing like unto Him, but He's the all-hearing and the all-seeing. He hears and sees, but not the way we hear and see. You guys see that? طيب. The third category is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. Monotheism related to devotional acts, the devotional acts of Allah's servants. What did we say about Rububiyyah? We said it was Tawheed Allahi fi af'alih. It is the singling out of Allah with respect to those actions which are specific to what? Him, the actions He does. The actions He does. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, it also deals with actions, but whose actions? The actions of what? Our actions, the actions of the servants of Allah. So this element means, in essence, to make Allah the exclusive recipient of the actions of His servants, exclusive to Him, meaning worship. So Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, af'al Allah, relates to the actions of Allah. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and it's also called Tawheed al-Ibadah, is af'al al-ibad. It's related to the actions that we perform that are exclusive to Allah, that should only be offered to Allah. You guys see that? All right, mumtaz. All right. Now remember, at the outset we said one of the reasons why we're studying this book is because there's a lot of attacks being waged against a Tawheed. And so we want to be able to nu'assil anfusana. We want to basically ground ourselves in a way where we can respond to those misconceptions, those dubious assertions, and those spacious arguments. And one of those spacious arguments, one of those shubuhat, is the claim or the assertion that the division of a Tawheed into three categories is a heresy, bid'ah. There is no evidence for it in the Quran or the Hadith literature. It was invented by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Muhammad al-Wahhab, al-Imam al-Mujaddid, rahimahullah ta'ala, he died in the year, if I'm not mistaken, 1206 after Hijrah. 1206 after Hijrah. So what they're saying is that before 1206 after Hijrah, or around about that time, no one had ever talked about dividing at-Tawhid in these three categories. Nobody had ever said that before him. He was the first one to what? To invent this. That's what they claim. So now how do we respond? How do we respond to that claim? Number one, there is evidence in the Quran. So the Quran itself, it speaks to these categories. And one verse, one example that the scholars give of an example where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to and highlights and alludes to these categories is from Surah Maryam, the 19th chapter of the Quran, verse number 65, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, رَبُّ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فَاعْبُدُهُ وَاصْطَبِرْ لِعِبَادَتِهِ هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. He says, رَبُّ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا. He says that He, Allah, is the Lord of the heavens and the earth and what is between them. What does He call Himself? The Lord. Tawhid ar-Rububiyyah. فَاعْبُدُهُ وَاصْطَبِرْ لِعِبَادَتِهِ. Worship Him and be patient, persevere in His worship. That's what Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, al-Ibadah. هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. Do you know for Him any one who shares His likeness, His qualities, His names? That's Tawhid al-Asma wa Sifat, right? So that's one example. The second proof is that the primary basis for these categories is what the scholars of Islam call a tatabbu wal-istiqra', a thorough review of the religious text by the scholars to reach an accurate picture of Islamic monotheism. So what they did was they studied the nusus from beginning to end to see what is the depth, what is the breadth of a tawheed, and what are its categories. And this is what they concluded. And this conclusion was reached by a number of scholars historically. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was not the first one to speak about these categories, but rather scholars who did this istiqra', this thorough review of the Quran and Sunnah, they came to the same conclusion. And among the people, I'll mention some of the names of these great scholars and the times in which they died. So you have an idea of how many years it was before the coming of Muhammad ibn Wahhab in which people were talking about these three categories of Tawheed. So the first one is Imam Abu Hanifa. Everybody knows, you guys know who that is, right? You've heard that name a few times before, right? Abu Hanifa, who died 150 after the Hijrah. 150 after Hijrah. That's a long time before 1206, isn't it? You also have his student, Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, who died in the year 182, long time before 1206. You also have Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, who died in the year 310 after Hijrah, long time before 1206. You also have, should I go? They can't see it. All that trouble, right? To get this thing right this time, and I got it facing the wrong way. Thank you, Abu Khadija. You also have Ibn Battah, who died the year 382. Ibn Battah, 382. You also have Ibn Manda, who wrote a book called Kitab, at-Tawhid. He called it Kitab, at-Tawhid, and in it he talked about these aqsam, these three categories. He died 395. Ibn Manda, 395. You also have Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, who spoke about this in just about every work that he talked about. Whenever he mentioned a tawheed, and in many of his books, most of his books, he mentions a tawheed, he mentions these three categories. Died 728, Ibn Taymiyyah, long time before 1206. And last but not least, and I don't mean last in terms of the last one, but the last one I'll mention, is Ibn al-Qayyim, his student, who died in 751, if I'm not mistaken, after Hijrah, again, long time before 1206. So that's a pretty good list of scholars, long before Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab al-Imam al-Mujaddid, who mentioned these categories of Tawheed. And the last response is that this categorization, based upon what is there, Hikayat al-Mawjud, is common to Islamic disciplines and within the disciplines. So, the scholars throughout history, they've looked at what is there. And then they've made like categories for everything Islamic. So for example, the Islamic disciplines, they looked at what was there. And they looked at the disciplines, what actually was there based upon what the Prophet taught and what the Quran contained. And they started dividing that into what? Disciplines. For example, al-fiqh, jurisprudence, ulum al-Quran, al-hadith, al-nahu, ila akhirihi, right? Even the disciplines themselves, they would divide them into subdisciplines. So ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran, they divided into what? At-Tajwid, how to recite the Quran correctly. At-Tafsir, how to understand it correctly. Al-Qira'at, Al-Qira'at, the different modes and ways that you can recite it. Is that not so? And even within the disciplines, you'll have them taking what is there, hikayat al-mawjood, and dividing it into what categories. So for example, in ilm al-nahu, they looked at the parts of speech in Arabic. They looked at the parts of speech in Arabic and said the parts of speech are three. What are they? Ismun, fi'lun, wa harf. Ismun, noun. Fi'lun, verb. Harf, preposition. Or either not a verb or not a noun. So this practice of taking what is there and dividing the category is something the scholars have done historically, bidun shay, bidun nakir, without anybody objecting to it. And the same thing is true for what a tawheed. These objections to the categorization of a tawheed, they're all new. So for example, you went back to the time of Abu Hanifa. You went back to the time of Ibn Manda. You went back to the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. You don't find people objecting to these categories, but they object now. And we're going to talk about this later because of the enmity they have for Imam al-Mujaddid Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. طيب. All right, let's circle back now. So we said that the third category of a tawheed is tawheed al-uluhiyya or tawheed al-ibadah. And we said that tawheed, which is very, very important for us to understand because this is where the ma'rakah, this is where the war between the prophets and their this is where it occurred. Generally speaking, the prophets, when they came to their people, the people didn't fight with them over af'alillah, the actions of Allah. Right? If وَإِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ لَيَقُولُونَ Allah. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they would say Allah. They didn't fight with the prophets about that. And they didn't fight with the prophets about asma'illah wa sifatihi. Generally speaking, they accepted what? The sifat, they accepted the asma. In fact, when the prophet came to Quraysh, they didn't object to any of the names of Allah except Ar-Rahman. That was the only one. Other than that, they accepted all the names the prophet mentioned in the Quran. But the ma'rakah, where they fought with the prophet and the prophets in general, was in this what? This tawheed al-ibadah. The right of Allah to be worshipped alone. Nobody should be worshipped, no act of worship should be offered to anyone besides Allah. So this is why we focus a lot on this one, tawheed al-ibadah. And we need to understand in order to successfully apply this tawheed, we need to understand what is worship. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala has a book called Al-Ubudiyya, the book of worship. And in it he gives this beautiful definition of worship. He says, هي اسم جامع لكل ما يحبه الله ويرضاه من الأقوال والأعمال الظاهرة والباطنة. What does that mean? He says, worship is a comprehensive term that encompasses all that Allah loves and is pleased with, whether statements or actions hidden or apparent. That's pretty comprehensive, isn't it? That means that worship is not just prayer, is it? It's not just fasting and rituals. But you can worship Allah by eating with what? With your right hand. You can worship Allah by entering the restroom with what? With your left foot. You guys see that? Anything that Allah loves and is pleased with. You can worship Allah by doing what? By brushing your teeth. Right? Because the Prophet said in the famous hadith, he said, as-siwak matharatun lil-fam, mardatun liman? Lil-Rabb. He said, this siwak, this toothstick, it is matharatun lil-fam. It's something which will cleanse and purify the mouth, but it's also something which pleases Allah. And we said worship is what? Anything that pleases Allah. You guys see that? Pretty comprehensive. طيب. So now what are some of the indications that an act is worship? How do we know? Since worship is so comprehensive in our religion, it's not just rituals. How can I say, hey, this is worship in our deen? Any and every indication that Allah loves something or is pleased with it tells us it's worship. For example, if He commands it. If He commands us to do something, we know He's what? pleased with it. Is Allah going to command us to do something He's displeased with? Is He going to tell us to do something to make Him angry? No, He wouldn't do that. So if He commands us to do something, we know that it's worship. If He praises the act or the actor, He praises the one who does something, or He praises the act itself, we know that He's pleased with it. Is Allah going to praise and speak highly of something He's displeased with? No, absolutely not. Then number 3, making the act a means to enter paradise. Is Allah going to give paradise to something that displeases Him? Absolutely not. So these are some examples. They're not exhaustive examples. We'll give a 4th one. If Allah explicitly expresses love for the act, right? Inna Allah yuhibbu at-Tawwabin wa yuhibbu al-Mutatahhirin. Allah loves those who repent and those who keep themselves clean. So these are just some examples, not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ways we can know that something is worship in our deen. And if we do it with the right intention, we'll get a reward from Allah. طيب. Now, what is the evidence that worship is the exclusive right of Allah? Because this is where the rubber hits the road right here. That we said that Tawhid al-Ibadah, Tawhid al-Uluhiyya, is ifradullahi bima yakhtassu bihi min af'al al-ibad. It is singling out Allah and making Him the sole recipient of those acts that the slaves do, that they should only do for Him. Right? Worship. So we need to prove that worship is something that should only be offered to Allah. So let's give a few nusus. We have many, but we'll give a few. Number 1 comes to us from Surah Al-Isra.